Well, in a 2021, a US court ruling ordered Apple to allow app developers more freedom to direct users to other payment options outside Apple's App Store. Now, the same court has found that Apple violated that order, imposed after an antitrust lawsuit brought on by Epic Games, the maker of Fortnite. Apple and one of its executives have now been referred to federal prosecutors for a criminal contempt investigation. Let's delve deeper into this with Josh Taylor, tech reporter with The Guardian Australia. Good to have you with us this evening. Now, firstly, can you explain to us why an antitrust case was brought on against Apple a few years ago by Epic Games?
Yeah, sure. So a couple of years ago, the beginning of it is essentially that on every transaction that you make through an app on the iPhone, Apple takes a 30% cut on that sale. And app developers particularly have been quite upset about this because they think it's basically Apple taking a lot of money off the top. The reason this got brought through an antitrust case was because Epic Games which is the maker of Fortnite, tried to launch its own payment store within the App Store, and then basically was kicked off the App Store as a result, and that's what kicked off all this sort of action, and that's been working its way through the courts for the past few years, and the US Supreme Court basically ruled against Apple, and now we've gotten to this situation where the lower court's ruling stands, and Apple has been now accused of not following that rule with the way that they've gone about trying to, implement the court's recommendations.
Yes, and then from your perspective, did Apple blatantly flout the court's injunction?
It will be interesting to see what happens, but I think the case that often happens with Apple in particular is they're so controlling over what's on their phones, what's on their platforms, that when these court rulings go against them, they will find ways to I guess skirt as close as they can to getting past the ruling. And they thought that this system that they implemented, which was basically that you could link to an outside store, but the app developer would still have to pay 27% tax on sales. And there'll be warnings saying, we can't trust this, we don't know if this is a reliable link. They thought, from Apple's perspective, they thought that this was them complying with the rules and what they argue is keeping their users safe on the platform and things like that. But the courts have not agreed. And it's interesting that this ruling came just after the EU had lodged a similar sort of complaints about this whole new system, and it looks like regulators around the world are not really taking kindly to what Apple has done so far.
Yes, so now Apple is facing a criminal contempt investigation, and also being referred to federal prosecutors. How significant is this development?
I mean, it's very rare for in a case like this for contempt sort of proceedings against a company, particularly what you could say is often the largest company in the world, Apple, to go through this process. Whether charges actually eventuate is going to be another thing entirely. And I'm assuming that Apple's going to be going through the whole appeals process and everything like that in the meantime. But it is quite significant, and I think it does show that this practice that Apple had been doing, it was the foundation of a lot of what the App Store and the iPhone in particular were built on, is not something that's really sustainable in the long term now, because regulators are not really happy about it.
And do you think Apple was genuine in saying that it took steps to comply with the injunction? So did they do that even though they were charging app developers for each transaction?
Yeah, I mean, it was how Apple interpreted it. I think that's probably a generous way of looking at it. They thought that they were meeting the requirements of the court ruling, and the similar with the situation with the EU. There's been this shift away from this idea that Apple and Google have their monopoly over their app stores and what can be sold on them and what they can make from it. And regulators around the world have said this is not good for competition in the long term, because you're basically taking all this money from these app developers at the same time. So, I think Apple may see it to be fair, but I just don't think that everyone else is on the same page at the moment.
And of course, Microsoft has been subject to something similar in the past, but would this put other major tech companies on notice?
I think so. I mean, it's very hard to see it sort of really playing far outside it, because Apple and Google effectively have the monopoly on stores on devices at the moment. So outside of those two, it's not really going to have all that much of an impact. And you are seeing other organizations sort of working to develop their own app stores now. You may ultimately end up being something with what Amazon does with its marketplaces and things like that. But I think what you'll see now is that if this ruling goes ahead, if Apple is forced to make further changes, that will be good for not only the US, but hopefully Australia and the rest of the world as well, because often when they implement these changes in one place, they implement them everywhere else too.
So do you expect that to happen here in Australia, given the moves by the EU and now the US?
Yeah, so there's a federal court case that's currently being decided in Australia that was brought by Epic Games against Apple and Google in Australia. That was heard last year. I think they'll probably wait for the outcome of that ruling before they make a decision. But if these other marketplaces are moving in that same direction already, if the ruling comes out against Apple and Google, we may end up seeing them saying, look, we're doing this elsewhere in the world, we'll start doing this here. So I think it's almost a foregone conclusion that something will change in the meantime. And I think a lot of app developers, particularly those, and a lot of consumers, because, it's really, the apps that don't allow you to make purchase in apps, it's really quite frustrating, and there's a lot of friction in trying to make that purchase outside of the app. If you have that option to do it without the Apple taking a stake on it, I think that's going to be a very good win for consumers as well.
Okay, Josh Taylor, thank you so much for explaining it all to us.
Thank you very much.